It's good to be with you all today, and it's good to just to see people. I think y'all probably are in agreement with that. I got a text this week from, and I know the Sal's don't worship here, but they're relatives to a whole bunch of you. Matt reminds me of that periodically, and he sent me a text. And frankly, I'm surprised it didn't come from Roscoe, but it came from Matt. And it was a picture of a dunking booth, and it was a social distancing baptism method. You know, you put somebody on the dunking platform and throw the ball and hit it, and they fall into the water. And he said that if that starts happening, that the accuracy and arm strength of the preacher or the elder comes into question. And that we might have drafts to see who has the good enough arm to get people in. And I told Matt that he could trust me, that I would get it done before he died or the Lord came back, one way or the other, that I would keep throwing at it. But it's a weird time, and that was a strange text. And I thought Matt was just worried about y'all and wanted to share it, so I wanted to pass it on, let y'all know that. We are continuing to study the sections of the Ten Commandments, and you can go ahead and turn there if you like, Exodus 20. And it's funny how God's law is set up. The first four commandments, the ones that we've looked at primarily already, to put God first, that you should have no other God before you, to not make any graven images. The second of the great commandments is a reminder that we shouldn't have any idols, including ourselves. The third, of course, is to keep His name holy, and the fourth is to honor the Sabbath, to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. All four of those relate to how we deal with God. But there's a division in the Ten Commandments. There's kind of two different types. And the first four are the first type. They're related to the way we approach God and the way we honor Him and give Him the credit that He deserves. The second set, though, the last six commandments, those commandments are more aimed at how we behave. They're morality commandments. They're commandments that deal with the way we interact with other people. And I've noted before that these commandments are a testimony to how God's law endures, and that even though we're through a difficult time, and I appreciate the song that we just sang, it helps me to know that on the other side of, and I don't know that Jordan, the river itself, had many waves in it, but our life sure does. And it's nice to know at the other side that there's going to be peace, and the evergreen shore will sing. The law is a reminder of that. It's enduring legacy. It was passed down 3,400 years ago and is still in active practice and use today. And this shows us that while God endures, His expectations for us endure too, even in difficult times. The second six remind us that there are some things that are acceptable and other things that are not. Things that are good and behaviors that we should avoid. And we need to kind of remember that the world has decided that we live in a post-moral society, that we don't need morals anymore, that you can do and act and be however you want to be. And that's true of all these last six commandments. In some ways, the world has decided that they're not relevant anymore, including today's. Exodus 20, please, and go ahead and read it, and just remember that God's expectations for us remain even in a world that says that they don't. Exodus 20, verse 12 says, to honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. This week, I read that it just goes, and this is not an indication that we as a country have not fulfilled that obligation anymore. But our parents, our grandparents by extension, mean something to us. This virus, over 7,000 of the deaths in our country are attributed to people living directly in assisted living or nursing home facilities. There have been, of course, the one that we talked about originally, the first batch of clusters of deaths was in a nursing home in Seattle. More recently, there's been more than 70 different nursing homes in our country that have had more than 25 deaths. In New York State alone, there's more than a dozen nursing homes that have had more than 25 deaths in that nursing home. There's one in Maryland right now that they found 24 in. In New Jersey, there was one where they had 15 bodies, kind of a makeshift morgue. They're falling so quickly. My point is that these things are horrifying. And this is a weird time because of this scare, if you have relatives or loved ones that are in a nursing home or assisted living facility, and there's a dozen of those, by the way, in Columbia, 3 or 4 more in Spring Hill, a couple of those in Mount Pleasant, they're completely cut off from the world right now. They can't leave and you can't go visit. And I think you know that, and it makes sense. It's a way to protect them. And it's why we take the precautions we take. But we are living in fear, and I think that this command, I think sometimes we decide that the old law is passed and the new law has taken its place and the commands no longer matter. Well, if anything, those deaths and that isolation and that seclusion that folks are experiencing tell us that this commandment to honor your father and mother is still just as much relevant today as it's ever been. We're going to spend just the next few minutes talking about how we do that today in a time where it's sometimes hard to do it. And I don't know the best way. When people are isolated at their homes, when they're isolated in places where they can only receive calls and FaceTime messages or emails and that kind of thing. But we do still have this obligation. And it's one that I think God set up in His wisdom, knowing that the family is God's intended design to solve the problems that come from loneliness, from isolation, from being basically where it's just you against the world. The family is God's intended way to combat that. Let's go ahead and look at Ephesians 6. There's a lot of passages that deal with this, and I think the easiest one to see, the one that we go to right away, what does it mean to honor your father and mother? And I know when I see there's at least a few families here with kids still, and it's especially true if your kids are still in your home, that these passages apply, and this is the way that we typically think of this commandment. Ephesians 6 starts with verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise. So Paul even quotes this commandment, the one that we've read already from Exodus 20, saying that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. And he goes on to say that fathers do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Ephesians was written at the same time in the same location to a different church, but at the same place as the book of Colossians. So Colossians has a lot of parallel passages to Ephesians, and that's true here too. Turn to Colossians 3, please. And Paul's a little bit more succinct in Colossians. It's like Colossians is like the condensed version of the book of Ephesians. It's a little shorter, and he gets more to the point. In verse 20, he says, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. And he goes on to talk about how bondservants should obey their masters in verse 22, also reminding fathers that they're not to provoke their children to wrath. But he says this about slaves, and I think this same thought would apply to children. Verse 23, whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. Here's the point. It becomes clear, I think, when you combine Ephesians and Colossians in particular, that when we honor our parents, and it begins with obedience to our parents, that we're really obeying God. That the way we see God, and you've heard this before probably, the way you see God is probably directly connected to the way you see your own father. That God can be distant and harsh sometimes if that's the way your dad was. If your dad was absent, then it's hard to believe that God is there. It's especially hard to know the love of God. And if your dad holds you to certain expectations and does raise you in discipline and the admonition of the Lord and tells you right from wrong, then it's easy to see that God wants to do that. And particularly if you know your dad loves you. When we obey our parents, we're fulfilling God's law and extending it to the way we obey God. Go ahead and look to Mark 7:2. We'll see that this is a problem that came up early too. When Jesus talks to the Pharisees, I think it's interesting that this is the command that he uses to emphasize that they were not fulfilling God's will in the way that they lived their lives every day. That they had decided about amongst themselves that God's law is no longer applied. Mark 7, verse 1, says, when the Pharisees gathered to him, and some of the scribes had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews did not eat unless they washed their hands properly, holding to the tradition of the elders. And when they come to the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. So they're real concerned with the elements, the particular observations of the law. And that's why they're asking in verse 5, why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? But Jesus' response is famous. And he quotes Isaiah, and he says, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, hypocrites, as it is written. These people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You keep the commandment of God and hold to the traditions of men. I don't think at this point any one of us would have guessed that the command that he says that they leave of God is to honor their father and mother. If I didn't know that's how this story ended, I certainly wouldn't have predicted that that's where it would go. But look what he says next. You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and mother, and whoever reviles his father or mother must surely die. But you say, if a man tells his father or mother, whatever you would have gained from me is Corban, that is given to God, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down. And many such things you do. Corban is an interesting thing. It's a word we don't use anymore. I think its definition will help us, though. According to Thayer's Greek definition, it states that Corban is a gift offered to God through the temple's sacred treasury, which tells us that they were taking money that they were going to give their parents or to support their parents, and they were giving it instead to the temple. And that, Jesus says, is a violation of the commandment to honor your father and mother. In Matthew's account, it's translated as what you would have gained from me is given to God. Either way, here's what we need to remember from this passage. That Jesus is saying to honor God is good. And that you honor your parents. That you honor God by honoring your parents. That the Pharisees had in their mind been saying, to honor my parents is good, but to honor God is better. And Jesus says that that's not how it works. He says that we have an obligation to continue to follow God's will in all that we do. And then in our mind, we can't just say that we'll keep some commandments and not keep others. I think this is hard for me because these commands sometimes remind us that it is important for us to submit our will to His. Because I think the Pharisees' general attitude is that God's laws don't apply to me. And this first of these 6 Ten Commandments that deal with morality is where we can do that. We sometimes decide that I know better than God does. That I don't have to do what God commands me to do. And that's particularly true if you don't get along well with your parents. I think before we go on in these next few weeks that we commit to the idea that Jesus is wanting the Pharisees to acknowledge something that they hadn't done very well. That I'm going to submit to God's will even when it's difficult. And I'm not going to look for just the easy way out, but I'm going to fulfill that command by trying to give up what I want and submit or replace what I want with what he wants. The epistles show us that he wants us to do this even today. You know, Romans 6 talks about that if we say that we've been baptized with him, that we'll be raised to walk in a new life, but that new life is one that does what he says. John says, quoting Jesus, that if you love me, you will keep my commandments. These verses all argue what the Pharisees in Mark 7 had forgotten. That to love God is to love his law. And to love his law means to follow his law, even in difficult times. And that to claim to love God is not an excuse to ignore him. So today, we're going to talk just these last few minutes about what it means and how we can fulfill the commandment to honor our father and mother beyond just obeying them. Because there comes a point when you're out of the house. You know, in life to read, that obedience is part of honoring their father and mother, but when they're 30 or 35 or 40, I don't expect them to obey like I do now. I'm not going to come home and give Harrison a call and say, hey, I know you're living in another state, but I want you to come mow the lawn today. You know, I'm not going to ask them to clean their rooms and to make dinner and supper. So to honor our parents is more than just obeying them. So as we remember that God wants us to follow his commands, we need to know what it means to honor our parents. Even though that is the beginning of that command. I want you to look at Proverbs 23, 13, and 14. This is one of my favorite little proverbs. We've been doing these kind of 2-minute reminders of the proverbs, the little video things and posted online. Proverbs is such a great book, and it kind of shows sometimes that God's people have had a sense of humor. And to raise our kids to obey is a father's obligation. And kids are supposed to obey their parents. Proverbs 23, 13, and 14, though, is the one that says, do not withhold discipline from a child. If you strike him with a rod, he will not die. Classic biblical understatement. You know, beat those kids is what it seems to be saying. Verse 14, if you strike him with a rod, you will save his soul from Sheol. To save his soul. The obligation of the father, clear from Ephesians 6 and from other proverbs like 22:16, which you all know, to train up a child in the way he will go, and when he's old he will not depart from it, is our job as parents. And the command to honor our parents is to acknowledge that our parents tried to do that for us. That they tried to teach us right from wrong. They tried to teach us the love of God. I want you to go ahead and also look at Proverbs 23. Because this proverb kind of shows that the obligation of honoring our parents and kind of a parent's wish in there. You see it in the verses from a bunch of these verses. Most of the proverbs are told in 1 or 2 verse couplets that are standalone. Proverbs 23 breaks that mold a little bit. And so you see things like this in verse 15. My son, if your heart is wise, my heart too will be glad. My inmost being will exult, and your lips speak what is right. Let not your heart envy sinners, but continue in the fear of the Lord all the day. Surely there is a future, and your hope will not be cut off. Here again in verse 19. Hear, my son, and be wise, and direct your heart in the way. Be not among drunkards or among gluttons, eaters of meat, for the drunkard and the glutton will come to poverty, and someone will clothe them with rags. Verse 22, listen to your father who gave you life, and do not despise your mother when she is old. Buy truth and do not sell it. Buy wisdom and instruction and understanding. The father of righteousness will greatly rejoice. He who fathers a wise son will be glad of him. Let your father and mother be glad. Let her who bore you rejoice. My son, give me your heart, and let your eyes observe my ways. I think what we can conclude after reading this passage and other passages like it, that to honor our father and mother is the beginning of a life with God where obedience and discipline are both expressions of love. That I show my love for God by the way that I obey him. I show my love for my parents by the way that I obey them. I discipline and train my children. That's part of the equation. When we take the love out of it, then discipline can become of use. When we forget that obedience is a part of love, then we say we love and then we don't act like it. Go ahead and go back to Proverbs 23, verse 22. And I want you to hear a little bit about how this works in everyday life. In that one verse it says, "Listen to your father who gave you life, and do not despise your mother when she is old." There is something about the way that parents and children react that leads to the stability of the family and the stability of the church. And you hear a little bit of the fear in that verse, fear that's expressed in biblical stories. You hear it when Naomi says, "Call me bitter," after her husband and her 2 sons die and she doesn't have any grandchildren at the beginning of the book of Ruth. You see it in the widow of Nain's fear when her son dies and Jesus is walking out of town and she's mourning, the only one who can provide for her. You see it in the first church dispute in Acts 6 when they're worried about who's going to take care of the widows. The fear of the ancient world is that in a society where children were the social security system, they didn't have cards and numbers and guaranteed payouts. Your children took care of them. So when people violate this basic command, you see society start to unravel. The difference is that God wants us to express in the way that we live compared to the world begin here. The relationship with our children doesn't end when our children leave the house or when you leave the house. Your spousal duties come first. I mean, the Bible does tell us to leave and to cleave. Leave our parents and cleave to our spouse. But those duties are still there. So we honor our parents to fulfill and to alleviate that fear that parents feel that when I get old, my kids are going to forget me and ignore me and reject me. So one of the practical ways that we fulfill this command is to take care of our parents. I think Jesus' anger with the Pharisees back in Mark 7 and Matthew 11 are because they were ignoring this basic requirement to fulfill the command to honor their parents because they weren't providing for them. In a world that tells you that we should live for our own, that we should take from our parents but not give back, the Bible reminds us that we're to give back. I had an aunt. It's funny sometimes when this happens, and you know, we have one example of this even in our congregation where Joe's wife is Joni. You know, the 2 names are so similar. My uncle's name was Bill, and his wife's name was Billy. And so, Uncle Bill and Aunt Billy. Aunt Billy was unusual. She was a real sweet, kind lady. She still is, by the way. We just saw her the last time we were in Searcy. And I watched her as a young boy take care of first her father, who fell into bad health and then poor mental health, and then he came to live with them in their home. And she watched her father until he passed away. I watched her watch my grandmother, who had really severe Alzheimer's, and when her husband died, it was another 12 years before she passed away, and she couldn't care for herself that whole 12 years. And for probably 10 of those years, she lived with my Uncle Bill and Aunt Billy for the most part. So I watched her nurse her father till he died, and then her mother-in-law, and then her own mother until she died. And then almost within 5 or 6 years of that death, her own husband, Uncle Bill, who was still with us, but entered into a period where his mind is not there anymore. So what did I see? From 1985 to 2020, over those 35 years, I've watched her probably spend 27 or 28 of those years caring for somebody else. What did I see? I saw a living example of somebody fulfilling this command to honor their father and their mother. Paul's letter to Timothy discusses this. If you'll turn, please, to 1 Timothy 5. To honor our parents we know means to obey them when we're young. And now we're talking about when they're older, to take care of them. 1 Timothy 5 talks about that. In verse 3, sometimes people argue that honor doesn't mean to take care of, but Paul means it very clearly in that sense here. In verse 3, he says, honor widows who are truly widows. Those two words there stand out. Truly is in the sense of the woman, the widow of name. No husband and no children. Widows in the church who have no one. And honor, as you can see from later in this same passage where he talks about elders being worthy of double honor, is definitely talking about taking care of their physical needs. And we can tell that from the verses that follow. Look at verse 4. So he says in verse 3, honor widows who are truly widows. In verse 4, but if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household, to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. Command these things as well, so that they may be without reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he is denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. When you look down at verse 16, and it says, if any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them, so that the church not be burdened, so that they may care for those who are truly widows. I guess what I'm saying is that you can't assume that the laws of the Old Testament go out of use in the New. Most are reaffirmed, including this one. And those of you who still have parents to take care of, to honor your parents means to take care of their physical needs. And I don't know, I'm not going to dare to tell you what that looks like. You know, in my grandmother's case, she lived with my Aunt Billy for 10 or 12 years, and then she lived in a full-time care facility for the last 2 years because it wasn't possible anymore. That may mean bringing them into your home, may mean making daily visits or calls, it may mean setting up a system where somebody's there to take care of them. But it says in verse 4 of this passage we just read that we learn godliness by making some return to our parents for the care that they gave us. So far from the scriptures, I think we've seen already that to honor our parents includes to obey them. And it includes to take care of them by meeting their physical needs. And there's one last area of honor that I think that we'll read just briefly before we close today. In Proverbs 23, we heard it, and we heard it a little bit in a few other places in the Proverbs. When we live a life consistent with the way that we were raised is the final way that we honor our parents. And you've probably noticed that before. As a teacher, I've noticed it. That you see families that come through and the way the kids act, you see certain patterns. You learn that there are families who the parents always defend the kid, and the kid is never wrong, and those kids are not much fun to teach, by the way. You see families where they come through and every one of those kids is pretty much buttoned up. And they do what they're supposed to do. They're nice and they're polite and they take care of their business, whether they're good students or not. And you love those kids. And it's a tribute to their parents. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to every rule. But it's the beginning of a process. By the way that we live, we show parents our honor. Proverbs 23, verses 24 and 25. We've already read these once before, but it says, the father of righteousness, the father of the righteous will greatly rejoice. He who fathers a wise son will be glad in him. And let your father and mother be glad, and let her who bore you rejoice. That's the kind of joy we're talking about. And the opposite is also mentioned in the Proverbs. From the Proverbs of Solomon, I think this is, I'm not sure, I don't think I got the right chapter down here, but one of the Proverbs is that a wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish son is a sorrow to his mother. And a similar proverb comes from Proverbs 15, verse 20. That, I think, was Proverbs 10, verse 1, I believe. Proverbs 15, verse 20 reads, "A wise son makes a glad father, but a foolish man despises his mother." You've heard the phrase before, raised better. You're raised better than that, so act like it. I think we've all known that and experienced that in our lives. So basically, what I'm asking you to do today, because sometimes your parents are gone. I know that's the case for some of you today. Your parents are no longer with us. How do you honor your parents today? By the way you live. We can honor our parents by living according to the ways that they raised us to live, particularly if those were godly ways. This has not been the typical lesson because we're still working through the Ten Commandments, and it's so personal. And I don't know any other way to teach that kind of lesson. Next week, we're going to study the next commandment, which is, "You shall not murder." A little easier to talk about that in an impersonal way. And we'll talk about how we can carry that out in our lives every day. But today, and this isn't Mother's Day, it's not Father's Day. It's a day dedicated to our Heavenly Father. But today, thank God if you had good parents. And if you didn't, strive to be the kind of parent or grandparent that you wished your parents had been. Honor your parents by taking care of your needs, by obeying them when you're under their control and in their home, and by the way that you live every day. Today, the invitation is open like it is always. When we meet, to remember the body and the blood of the one who came for us. But that meal that we'll partake of here in a few moments is necessary because we sinned. The Jesus' act of his death and resurrection had to happen because we don't honor our Heavenly Father very often in the way that we live, in the way that we talk, in the way that we act. So today, the opportunity for you to repent, to confess is available, or to become His child forever. And it may be the greatest way to honor your physical parents, is to live in a way that would honor your heavenly parent. If you need to come, you have that opportunity now while we stand.